I mean, I guess the silence is killing me, so I'm going to go ahead and start with my announcements. So my name is Nicole Federo. I am the EAA events coordinator, and I'm the person who's put together all these events this summer. So I'm super excited. This is our fourth virtual event of the summer, and they're going pretty well. It's nice to see all of you. Many of you have been to a lot of them, actually. So it's nice that you've been coming to all of them. Our real purpose of these virtual events is to reach out to our members with inspiring content. And we know that we all need a lot of inspiration right now because we're kind of venturing into the unknown for this particular fall. And so we're really trying to engage our members, make them feel supported because we are a grassroots organization and your voice is an important voice to us. So next week is a really important event for all of us. It's called the Looking Forward Panel. It's a panel discussion that will be on Tuesday, July 28th at 6 p.m. Our panelists are kind of from all different types of Montessori, public, private, big schools, small schools, and they're going to kind of talk to you guys a little bit about their experiences in the fall and or in the spring and what they're going to be planning to do in the fall. We'll have some opportunities for breakouts. This, of course, is a free event to anyone. So if you have a friend who's a Montessori teacher who is, for this one particularly, is not an EAA member, this is your opportunity to reach out to them and, you know, help them see what EAA is all about. They had the membership when they graduated, but then they have let that lapse. This is a really wonderful opportunity to see, again, like that you are in a supportive community, your voice is important. And if you have a question, that there are experienced Montessori teachers out there who can help you and guide you, or at least be a sounding board. And so we find these events will be really important. And again, it's a perfect opportunity to see what EAA is all about. Regina Solowowski is our outreach coordinator. She's not here tonight, but she will be putting together a collection of stories, a digital book. She put something out on EAA Talk this week. But if you are someone who has a really wonderful story that you would like to contribute, it will be put in a collection that we're going to give to the graduates electronically because, you know, we're all trying to support them because that's what our organization is about. And we want to give something that they can access and use going forward and doesn't require any kind of material, really. And so those are my announcements for today. And I'm very, very excited to introduce our presenter tonight, Christina Carroll. She has over 12 years of experience in the classroom. She's worked in lower L, she's worked in upper L, she's been an assistant, but she has recently transitioned out of the classroom to be a student once more, and has started a graduate program researching Montessori education with Professor Angeline Lillard at the University of Virginia on developmental psychology. And she is just going to be a wealth of knowledge tonight. So I'm really excited to hear her presentation. And really, I think us as a board, we're talking about how important during this time period it is to look back on the past and to see the trends and to use those lessons or those inspiration from the past in considering the unknown that we're going into in the future. In the next few weeks, for me, like 3 weeks. So Christina Carroll, I turn it over to you. And there she is.
Awesome. Hello, everybody. It's good to see everyone. I don't know about you, but I've been like sheltering in place for so long. I'm like people on the screen. It's great. So I wanted to give a quick, she gave a little introduction into who am I, but I wanted to talk a little bit about why I'm even interested in this topic of the history of education. So I started out as a teacher right after university doing Teach for America. And I taught on the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota for 2 years in a middle school, and got to experience firsthand what it's like to teach in a public school system. Then I decided I want to go to graduate school, so I just need a job to tide me over until I get accepted into graduate school. So I found a primary assistant position. I had no idea what was Montessori. I just wanted a job to tide me over. But within 4 months, I fell in love with Montessori and decided to take my Montessori elementary training instead of going to graduate school at that time. So then I had years and years of experience in the Montessori elementary. And my experience as a teacher in the public school system versus a teacher in the Montessori education system are completely different. And, you know, looking at the world from a cosmic education point of view, I wondered, you know, what is the history behind these two systems? How is it that we have these two very different systems happening? What led to the development of these two very different systems? So I have a timeline to share with all of you. Let me see if I can share my screen. Oh, give me a moment. And should be able to get this into presenter mode. Here we go. Are you guys able to see the timeline? Yes? All right, brilliant. So we're going to start off looking at the era of 1770 to 1890. And as you can see, I've broken up this era into American public education and Montessori education. And each of the eras are broken up into these two different sections. Let's go ahead and dive into American public education. So we're going to begin with the time period right before the Revolutionary War. At this point in time, if there's a school in an area, it's because the local families have gotten together. They have pooled their resources, pooled their funds, found a location, and found different materials for the students. Very, very young children attend what are called dame schools. And this is a little more than what we would consider a daycare. The materials they're using at this point are these horn books. You can see they're learning their letters. They're beginning to learn maybe some prayers. The pieces of paper are attached to a wooden paddle, and then there's a lamination using cow horn, which is why they're called horn books, with the goal of, you know, these books being able to be used year after year with many different children. As children grew older, they then would attend grammar schools. And the main textbook in use at the time was the New England Primer. You can see it here. And this was a very British-based textbook. You can see King George is right there on the front cover. And I know in my training, it was suggested that we should have this in our classroom, and it was really interesting to go through. You can see that some of the letters are even printed a little bit differently than we would see today. So for example, here in the word assemblies, the S's here are almost shaped as F's. So it's interesting to see that even the print was a little bit different during that time period than what we would typically experience today. And then once a child was finished with grammar school, if they were from a very affluent family, they would then be able to go on to some sort of college. But at this point, there's no formal education system, as of course the nation hasn't even formed yet. But post-Revolutionary War, there was a big focus amongst educators in using education as a forum to provide a national identity. One of the educators who was really interested in this was Noah Webster. He wanted to throw out all of those British-based textbooks and have instead American-based textbooks that used American heroes, American stories, American values, and of course, according to Noah Webster, one of his most important focuses was an American national language. And so when he created his spelling book, he created alternative American English spellings and pronunciations that were different from the British English system. And this was the forerunner to Webster's American Dictionary of the English Language. So if you ever wondered why Americans spell certain words a little bit differently than the British do, it's because of Noah Webster and his plan of creating a national identity through language. This would be a really interesting story for the children to look at those different spellings and how they came to be. The very first person who had the idea of some sort of publicly funded education system was Thomas Jefferson. He said, "Preach a crusade against ignorance, establish and improve the law for educating the common people. General education will enable every man to judge for himself what will secure or endanger his freedom." So he had this plan that every child would be able to attend 3 years of publicly funded education. At the end of those 3 years, a small group of boys would be selected to obtain scholarships to attend further education through grammar school. And at the end of grammar school, an even smaller group of boys would be selected to receive further scholarship to go to university. Unfortunately, this proposal did not include any children who were enslaved at the time, and beyond the 3 years, it didn't include girls either. So even though this system was only for 3 years and didn't include everybody, it was still considered a really radical idea, and the Virginia Assembly turned it down each time Thomas Jefferson presented this idea. They didn't like the idea after having just fought a war that was partially based on taxation. They didn't like the idea of instituting a new form of taxation. They also didn't like the idea of the state being in control of schools when they thought it should really be the business of the local area to decide what was going on in the local schools. So unfortunately, Thomas Jefferson was not successful in creating a publicly funded school system. However, Horace Mann was. He was the first Secretary of Education. He was based in Massachusetts. And part of his job was to go and visit schools in the local area. And what he found was, given that schools were locally funded and that each community had different resources available to them, there was great inequality and inequity in schools. So he created a plan for what he called common schools. This idea that every child should be able to go to a public school and that they would be so good, the public schools would be so strong that no one would be interested in sending their child to a private school. He said, "It is a free school system. It knows no distinction of rich and poor. It throws open its doors and spreads the bounty of its table for all the children of the state. Education, beyond all other devices of human origin, is the equalizer of the conditions of men." So he had these sort of lofty goals and ideas for what he wanted the public education system to be. And while he wasn't able to obtain all of them, he was able to obtain some sort of regulation for teacher training and begin a public school system in the northern states. So he was really sort of the founder of public education in the United States. Even during these early days, there was work to be done towards equity. And the first thing that surfaced was the debate about religion in schools. One example was in New York City. During this time period, over half of the folks in New York City were immigrants. All of the public schools at the time were Protestant-based schools. Many of the schools would use Protestant prayers, and the textbooks would have not only information about the Protestant religion, but then disparaging information about other religions and even about certain cultures. So you can see here, Bishop John Hughes, a Catholic bishop, he advocated for Catholic schools to be funded through through public funds. If Protestant schools can be funded publicly, why not Catholic schools? So it started this great debate about religion in schools. And at the end of the day, the New York City decided that they would not be funding any schools that had any sort of religious affiliation. So the teachers had to go through and strike out any sort of information in the textbooks regarding any sort of religious reference, and they had to discontinue their use of prayer within schools. Additionally, in 1855, segregation was addressed in Massachusetts schools. In Boston, for example, there were only 2 schools that Black students were able to attend, even though sometimes they would have to pass by multiple other schools on their way to one of those 2 schools. So one family decided to attempt to enroll their child in one of these other schools that their daughter passed along the way. She was not able to enroll. They wound up taking this to the state courts, where unfortunately they upheld the idea of separate but equal. The families in Boston were not pleased with this, so they went straight to the Massachusetts legislature and advocated to abolish segregation in schools. And so in 1855, Massachusetts was the first state to abolish segregation in their schools. So that's an overview of the very beginnings of education in the public sector. Let's take a look at what's going on in the Montessori world. So Montessori is just being born. In 1870, she was born at around 5 years old. Her family moved to Rome. She had varying interests, but finally settled upon the idea of going into medicine, and in 1890 was admitted into the University of Rome. She was the first female to be admitted into the program for medicine, and even had to have the approval of the Pope himself in order to help her get admitted. And by 1896, she became Italy's first female doctor of medicine. So that's what's going on in the Montessori world. Let's take a look at the next era on the timeline. So 1890 to 1950. And let's check out American public education during this time. So just to give some historical context for this time period, there's a massive influx of immigration, and due to this, there's a lot of urbanization happening. Not only are major cities spreading, but industrial towns are popping up across the country. Child labor laws have not yet been instituted at this time, so children definitely have that as an alternative to going to school. World War I, the Great Depression and World War II occurred, and at the very end of this time period, the Cold War began. So just keep that in the back of your mind as you're hearing about what's happening in schools during this time period. So in schools at this point, there's usually like the one classroom schoolhouse, right? With one teacher who's teaching a variety of different ages, a variety of different subjects. There's a lot of recitation happening, memorization and recitation. So there's not, at the very beginning of this period, a lot of the structure that we know now. And it's during this period that much of this structure comes into place. Oh, let's go back. Sorry about that. Let's go right here. Okay. So in 1905, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching is established. And the prominent leaders of universities gather together to form some standards for university study. And based on the standards that they formed, public schools and high schools in particular then started changing how they were structured in order to support students as far as getting into university. So one of the ways they changed their structure was starting to measure their class periods using the Carnegie unit. So it's kind of similar to this idea of credits nowadays, right? Like the way they measure how much credit you're going to get for a class is how much time you've spent on that class. So you have to have like measurable chunks of time. So the idea of the Carnegie unit measured chunks in these 50-minute single subject class periods. That way, high schools could say, you know, students have studied these particular subjects and they've spent this much time in these particular subjects as they were applying to get into university. The other implication of the changes of the university standards was that high schools started to specialize their teachers into subject departments. So instead of having the one teacher who's teaching a variety of ages, variety of subjects, teachers are now starting to teach and specialize in just one subject area, and the children are moving from teacher to teacher, or the teachers are coming in and out. So we start to see a little bit more structure sneaking in. Next, during the early 1900s, we see the growth of progressive education. And this might ring a bell a little bit for us as Montessorians. In 1899, John Dewey published the book called The School and Society. And here's a quote from his book. "The educational center of gravity has been too long in the teacher, the textbook, anywhere and everywhere you please, except in the immediate instincts and activities of the child himself." So Dewey suggested, similar to Montessori, that we look to the child to direct and guide education. He suggested that we include more movement, more variety as far as what topics and interests we're covering. Larry Cuban, an education historian, had this to say: "John Dewey believed that if schools were anchored in the whole child, in the social, intellectual, emotional, and physical development of a child, that teaching would be different, and that learning would be different, and that schools would be very different, hospitable places for children." So this might ring a little bell for us as Montessorians. But instead of creating a whole new school system and structure based on these progressive ideas, folks were trying to incorporate these progressive ideas into the conventional school system. And one area, one of the country that did this really well was Gary, Indiana. It was one of those industrialized towns. What's happening there? And you can see a picture here of the children. They're holding up little signs of where they're from. This town had grown up with immigrants coming in seeking employment in the local factories. So the school system had to figure out how to meet the needs of all these different children. William A. Wirt, the superintendent at the time, came up with what was called a split shift system, with this idea that children would spend a certain amount of time in one classroom, and then throughout the day they would move from classroom to classroom to classroom, therefore incorporating movement into education. So instead of incorporating movement into the lessons, sort of like we do in our Montessori classrooms, they incorporated movement in through asking children to move from classroom to classroom as they were studying throughout the day. The progressive education system, though, sort of died out by around 1917, 1918. And we'll see that idea come back in just a moment. So as we had so many people coming into the US, and we were looking in the Industrial Revolution at this time, we were trying to figure out how can schools prepare people for the workforce. So in an effort to provide some sort of efficient school management, high schools began career tracking. They had household arts, industrial, commercial, and college preparation tracks. But the difficulty was, how do we sort students into these various tracks? They decided, being that IQ testing, especially in the world of psychology, became really popular at the time, they decided to use IQ tests to sort students into these various tracks. Unfortunately, over time, we saw that this introduced a great deal of cultural bias into the tracking system. For example, in Los Angeles at the time, there's a high population of Mexican Americans, and over 2/3 of Mexican Americans that took the IQ test were classified as slow learners and put into industrial and special education tracks. They were overrepresented in these tracks by over 287% at the time. Some school districts bypassed the IQ test altogether and created segregated schools. So some school districts created schools just for Mexican Americans that had only the industrial track, didn't offer the other tracks at all. This is also the era of boarding schools for Native Americans. So they came in, only the industrial track was offered, and in addition to that, they were not allowed at all to speak their language or in any way practice their cultural practices. So there's this strong idea of assimilation still happening in schools. And this was going on between the 1930s and the 1970s, and the idea of tracking and testing is still quite controversial today. And finally, at the end of this period, there was this race to space, and the Russians launched Sputnik. They got there before the Americans, and the Americans were really fussed about this. And they thought to themselves, well, it must be because we're not providing a really strong education in math and science. So the very next year after the launch of Sputnik, President Eisenhower passed the National Defense Education Act, in which schools were to focus on high-level math and science education. And they provided over $100 million per year to be spent on these types of programs. So you can see this idea of international competition starting to creep into how school systems are structured at that time. So let's take a look at what's going on in the Montessori end of things. So in the early 1900s, to give a little perspective, Dr. Montessori started the first Casa dei Bambini in 1907 in the San Lorenzo ward of Rome. So just a few years later, in 1911, McClure's magazine produced a series of articles about Montessori, just saying how wonderful it was and how we need to bring this to America. This is amazing. So a lot of philanthropists and really wealthy industrialists at the time jumped in and to try to fund the beginning of a Montessori movement in the United States. And again, in the year 1911, the very first Montessori school opened in Tarrytown, New York. There was a formation of the Montessori Education Association. And again, it was just populated by folks who were very well known at the time. So Alexander Graham Bell and Mabel Bell were a part of it. The daughter of Woodrow Wilson, the editor of National Geographic, the US Commissioner of Education. So some really big names were involved in this, and there was a lot of money going toward the establishment of Montessori schools and sending folks to Montessori training. There was this real thirst for information about Montessori. There was over 187 English publications at the time. Harvard started to translate Montessori's book, The Montessori Method. And in 1913, Dr. Montessori was invited to the United States to tour for 3 weeks, giving lectures that were often, you couldn't accept everybody who wanted to attend. So it was just this huge insurgence of people wanting to know about Montessori. At this point, by 1916, there were over 104 schools. So in the course of about 5 years, we went from 1 school to 104 schools. Unfortunately, just as soon as there was this sort of major fervor for Montessori education, there was also sort of a downfall. There were some pretty influential critics, and the most influential was William Hurd Kilpatrick of Teachers College. He was a well-known academic, and he had started studying Montessori education, and he printed the Montessori System Examined, in which he said that Montessori had shoddy science, that she misunderstood child development, that the children were restricted and could not practice self-expression, that the materials actually inhibited learning, and that reading was introduced way too early. So this really sort of stunted the growth of the Montessori movement. People took a real, especially people in the public sector, took a real second thought to, do we really want to invest at all in Montessori? So instead of investing in Montessori as a home movement, they started selecting different ideas and incorporating them into public school programs such as the kindergarten. So Montessori schools came, and over time Montessori schools went By the end of this era, there were no Montessori schools at all in the United States. So moving on to the very next era, 1950 to 1980. So during this time, forging a path toward equity and equality was really brought to the national forefront as far as schools were concerned. And it was brought to the forefront in 4 areas: segregation, cultural representation, gender equality, and children with disabilities. We'll go ahead and take a peek at each of these, just a brief overview. So May 17th, 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka verdict was pronounced by Judge Earl Warren, in which he said, "It is doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed in life if he is denied the opportunity of an education. Such an opportunity is a right which must be available to all on equal terms. Separate facilities are inherently unequal." So while the Supreme Court abolished segregation in schools, unfortunately, it didn't have the power to enforce this ruling. And even 10 years later, 98% of Southern Black students attended segregated schools. It wasn't until 10 years later that the Civil Rights Act was passed. President Lyndon Johnson passed this act, and he himself had been an educator in Texas, so he sort of knew how things worked, and he knew sort of where to press the pressure buttons in order to instill change in schools. So the Civil Rights Act basically said no federal institution may discriminate based on race, and if it does, we will discontinue any sort of federal funding. So he was basically saying, look, you guys, you can have segregated schools, but if you do, we're not going to fund them federally. So as soon as schools realized their funding might get cut, they started to see change. And 8 years later, you could see that 87% of Southern Black students were able to attend integrated schools. But it makes you wonder, why 87%? What's going on with the other 13%? And even today, segregation is still pretty entrenched, particularly in urban areas in our schools. So it's something we're still trying to overcome. The next area that was addressed was cultural representation. Assimilation was definitely one of the functions of education throughout the history of our schools. But by this time, different groups wanted to start to see their culture represented in schools. And by the late 60s, Mexican Americans in particular were forming, students were organizing walkouts, families were organizing protests. One example is in Crystal City, Texas, in which students presented their school board with a list of sort of ideas as to how to have greater cultural representation within their school. They wanted teachers and counselors that were more culturally representative. They wanted equal access to different extracurricular activities and such. The board, unfortunately, did not hear their demands. And over time, the families became frustrated with this. And at the next board election, they voted in a brand new board that was culturally representative. And at that point, the school system there in Crystal City, Texas, started to shift and change and really became a hotbed for bilingual education, because before this, students weren't able to speak their own language or any language other than English within the school system. There was another big step forward in bilingual education when the Supreme Court ruled on Lau versus Nichols in 1974. In this case, there was a Chinese American student in San Francisco. All the San Francisco schools were teaching in English, and they claimed we are giving equal education to everyone because we're giving them all the same thing. So it's all in English. And the Supreme Court didn't buy that. They basically said, if the child doesn't speak English, then you're not actually giving them an education. So the ruling on this court case required publicly funded schools to provide English language education for students who were not proficient in English. So in some ways, they're moving a bit more towards this idea of cultural representation in schools. The next issue that was addressed was gender equality, and Title IX was passed in 1972. And this was a movement towards equal funding for boys and girls activities. Either the girls should be able to participate in the boys' activities, or there needs to be equal funding for the girls to be able to participate. Unfortunately, just like with segregation, while this act was passed, there was not much enforcement. So by 1974, the Women's Equality Action League stepped in the case of Dorothy Raffel, excuse me. She wanted to play basketball. She was not allowed on the boys' team. The school said, okay, we'll form a girls' team. And they essentially put a teacher in the gym with some basketballs and said, okay, girls, you can go and play. And she said, this wasn't a team. This isn't the same. This isn't to the same level of the boys' basketball team. And I want to be able to compete. So they took this case to the federal government, basically claiming, look, you passed this act and you did not enforce it, and we're going to hold you to it. They won their case, and thankfully, based on that, they did start to see gender equality changes in schools. And then the final movement during this era was equal access for children with disabilities. So in November 9th, 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was passed. It has now been renamed as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, basically saying that children with disabilities need to have equal access to educational opportunities. So schools were definitely reflecting this movement culturally as a nation towards equality and equity. Obviously, this is something that we're still very much working on, but at this point, these things were being more nationally addressed than they had been previously. So let's take a look at the Montessori end of things. So if you remember, at this point, by 1950, there were no more Montessori schools in the US. However, after 40 years, Montessori did make a comeback. And it was based on the story of a gal named Nancy McCormick Rambush. She had heard about Montessori, she had done some readings, she had been abroad and seen Montessori schools in Europe, but it wasn't until she had her first child that she suddenly became passionate about finding an education system for children that's an alternative to the conventional system that's being offered. So in 1953, she attended the 10th International Montessori Congress. There she met Mario Montessori and they began a correspondence. Based on his suggestion, she wound up taking the training in London. And by 1958, she had opened the Whitby School in Greenwich, Connecticut. So sort of, the second resurgence of Montessori in the US. Based on their correspondence, Mario Montessori named her as the representative for AMI here in the United States and supported her in beginning the American Montessori Society as a way to expand Montessori here in the US. And she was a huge advocate about spreading the word about Montessori. She wanted this idea of Montessori to be an American Montessori program that was a progressive education system rather than being a transplant of the Montessori program from Europe to America. And that was a little bit more culturally acceptable at the time, and the word about Montessori started spreading. Unfortunately, there was a little bit of a split. So in 1958, AMS was the representative for AMI in the US, and they had the authority to start Montessori schools and to begin training centers. Unfortunately, by 1963, there was great differences in opinion between Nancy and Mario about how Montessori should be represented in the United States. And by the end of 1963, AMS voted to dissolve the relationship with AMI, and by 1979, AMI-USA was established. So by the end of this period, there was definitely this distinct and separate divide between AMS and AMI. But rather than focusing on that, I think it's kind of amazing that it went from no Montessori schools, no Montessori presence, to one gal who was passionate about Montessori, and then the Montessori blossoming to the point where it's now here to stay. And there are two, at least two at this point in time, representatives and groups and associations providing Montessori training and Montessori schools. So that's actually a lot of growth happening during that time. And I almost wonder sometimes if, looking at from a more unified point of view, if the two groups sometimes, stimulate each other competitively to do a little bit better and grow together. So now we're going to be on to our very last era, 1980 to the future. In American public education, during this time period, there was an economic downturn. So in the late 70s, early 80s, there was an economic downturn. There was great concern that the United States was not competing internationally. We're not very competitive. And of course, they then turned their focus to education. We must not be competitive because our schools aren't providing the type of education we want. So in 1983, there was a report written called A Nation at Risk. And in this report, it outlined this idea that it's due to education that we're not as internationally competitive as we'd like to be. And this report made some suggestions. It suggested that we increase graduation requirements, lengthen the school year, and add some more testing into schools. State governors had been asking for more support, had been advocating, especially for financial support. But at this time, the national government hadn't really taken a role in dictating how schools should go about increasing student achievement. So by 1989, President Bush decided to gather all the governors together and hear what they had to say and come up with some national goals. So this was the very first time there was this idea of let's make some national goals that we can all get behind. Based on these national goals that were decided, there were 6 at first and then 8, 2 more added later. Some of the goals were quite lofty. For example, one was the United States should be #1 in math and science education by the year 2000. So based on these national goals, states were then starting to mandate curricula and standards, and they started to adopt practices of accountability through high stakes testing. So based on that, let's take a look at high stakes testing and see how that sort of progressed over time. So in 1997, President Bill Clinton instituted testing at the 4th and 8th grade level. In 2001, No Child Left Behind was passed, and children were tested every year. Those scores were shared publicly. And at that point, they were definitely using test scores as measures of accountability. So there was this idea of if you're doing well, you'll get rewarded in some sort of way, but there's going to be some sort of sanctions placed upon you if your school is not doing well. By 2009, Obama instituted Race to the Top, which was essentially a fund of money. And he said, your school can have some of this money if they're willing to use high stakes testing as a measure of accountability for educators. So again, pushing this idea of accountability. And in 2005, they passed Every Student Succeeds Act, which still has testing, but some see it as sort of pulling back a little bit in that it allows states and schools a little bit more freedom as to how they go about meeting those testing standards. So in addition to high stakes testing, another way that they decided to improve student achievement was through school choice. There were these business roundtables set up, and you can look this up online. They still exist, there's plenty of them, where business leaders get together and decide, well, here's what's working in businesses. Maybe we can take that and bring that into schools and see if that's gonna work there. And high stakes testing is very much part of that idea of like, let's set some goals, let's test folks to see if they're achieving those goals and then offer rewards or punishments based on that. Well, another idea based on these business roundtables was the idea of marketplace competition. So if there's competition amongst schools, maybe schools then will have the desire to enhance and get even better. One example of this was in East Harlem, New York City. They were at the bottom of performance for so many years. And then they decided, you know, instead of these really big schools that we have, why don't we divide them into smaller schools, and each school will have its own focus, and the schools that are successful will stay, and the schools that are not won't. And they'll be dissolved and restructured. And over time, the East Harlem schools started achieving higher and higher levels, and was able to sort of move up the ladder in New York City. So based on this idea, public schools started offering different options, such as magnet schools that were, the goal there was to, another idea of how to fight segregation. They would have magnet schools that would be given extra money to have some like really lovely program that would entice folks from all around the area to attend. Different vouchers were offered, so families would receive public funding to be able to send their children to private schools. There was a resurgence of homeschooling. There was even, interestingly enough, a movement for private management of public schools. Companies were coming in saying, we can manage the school and do it more cheap, at a more cheap rate, because we're able to take advantage of competition in the market. And so public management became a thing. And then of course, charter schools started to proliferate as well, in which they would have a plan and certain goals, and 3 to 5 years later, they'd be assessed to see, you know, are you achieving your goals? And then they'd see if their charter was extended or not. So the desire for achievement played a role in shaping how education is going today. Let's take a look at Montessori education. So there was this divide, you know, when we left off in the last era between AMI and AMS. However, Montessori as a whole was expanding. And during this era, there was a greater focus on respect and unity to promote Montessori worldwide. And so you saw a great deal of expansion. If you focus here on in the United States, you could see that schools themselves were growing, not only as far as how many children were attending, but as far as what types of programs they were offering. On the side here, you can see the number of private Montessori schools just really exploded. You know, in 1959, there was just that one, so you can't even see the bar. In 1970, there was 355, and then by 2008, there was over 5,000. Not only was there an expansion in the private sector, but also in the public sector. By 2015, there were over 500 public school programs, and this really expanded as there was that focus on charter and magnet schools. Because of this major growth, there's also been an interest among researchers. You know, so there's been not only Dr. Lillard's book here on Montessori, the science behind the genius, but so many new research studies cropping up to look at, you know, how does Montessori education shape child development? And hopefully next summer, I'll be giving a presentation on that at the summer conference, so you can get the cutting edge of what's going on in Montessori research today. So that is a basic overview, just sort of a real quick timeline of Montessori and public school education. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen because I'm thinking I would like to give you guys some time to think about what you just heard. I know it was like me talking for so very long. I want you to be able to process what you heard. I'm going to type some questions into the chat over here and have you guys, well, let's see, there's just a few of us. So maybe we should, I don't know, maybe we shouldn't have breakout groups. We can have a discussion, I think.
Yeah, usually 15 is a pretty good amount of people.
Yeah. All right, so let's do that then. I was thinking if there's so many of us, we should do breakout groups, but there's only a few. So I guess I'll throw out the questions there and you guys can go with it where you want to go with it. So I guess what sort of stuck with you from the presentation? What did you find maybe interesting or something you didn't know before? A second thing you could focus on is how does this knowledge, you know, how could it shape your practice as a Montessorian and maybe, you know, your contribution to the Montessori movement? And then a final question could be, you know, how could you take any of this information and bring it into your classroom? So give that a rumble in the brain for a few minutes and see if you have any ideas or answers. Also, if you have any questions, I'll try to answer what I can the best I can.
Well, I'll say something.
Right.
One of the things that struck me, and you know, we hear about the race to space, and you know, Sputnik, and these are things that I remember learning about in middle school and high school, and it just struck me as so, of course, like, oh my gosh, that seems to be the real beginning of when this push towards math and science, and the beginning of you know, this high achievement that just seems to be so driven for purposes that are not inherent to what is good for the child. And I just feel like, whoa, you know, thank you for, you know, for putting it on such a beautiful timeline that it struck me so, you know, so profoundly. So that was what really hit me, like, whoa, this is where some of this started. So that's my.
Yeah. Like in addition to that, there's, you know, there's this testing internationally, right? So like we're like a lot of folks are looking at like international rankings of education, and you know, some countries have been very like lauded for like, oh, you constantly are at the top. You know, everyone's looking at Finland. What are they doing over in Finland? You know, and it's great to like share ideas about education. But again, it introduces this idea of like international competition. And is it really for the ends of meeting child's need, you know, child development? Yeah.
Exactly. I'm so glad we're Montessorians.
Yeah.
Well, actually, you know, I say that I'm so glad that we're, as a nation, I hope that we are broadening our perspective, not just not in Montessori. So.
I was struck by how few people got to say in how we did this. Segregation in particular, so deep, because somebody who spoke up and was listened to got their way, and the real people didn't get to have a choice on where they ended up. And it really speaks to that dominant culture, and in this case, even fewer people than I realized had influence on how our children were treated. And I mean, that gives a little bit of a story too, but it just means that we as individuals need to really work together to get that word out, and realize that our voices do need to be heard. We can't let just those few people continue to make these decisions. It has to be a bigger voice that works together. And I don't know how we do that, but I think we're starting to get a start. But I almost feel like this needs to be brought out there as part of our story, to say, look, these few people got to say this and got to tell people this is where they were going to be in life. And this has hurt so many people that we need to find another way to do this. And this is part of that story. So thank you for that timeline, because it really opened that up.
Yeah, one of my interests is looking at, because I think Montessori has been sort of more involved in this idea of a culturally representative education system, right? I don't know if you guys know about ESF, Education Sans Frontiers, and the, what is it called? Montessorians for Social Justice. There's just this, you know, this movement of, you know, we really are a worldwide movement of education. We are serving people from a variety of different cultures, not just variety of cultures within the United States, you know? And so it is a system that can be tailored to meeting the cultural needs of the students. And I was particularly struck not only by how few people sort of influenced the creation of our system, but I really found it touching the stories of the parents who stood up for their children. I didn't go into deep because I only, you know, have a few minutes to talk about this whole timeline. But there are just these really great stories about, you know, dad stood up for his daughter. I mean, that was the whole 1855, abolishment of segregation in Massachusetts. It was a dad who was like, no, I will not let my daughter, struggle and educate. And it was just seeing parents' passion and seeing people who were having sort of those hero stories. I always find those more inspiring. Like, we can do that. If dad can stand up for his daughter, we can stand up for our students,
Christina, thank you so much for doing this. I would like to propose also in the future, maybe in either your research or someone else's, we have a wealth of historical figures still alive in the United States who have contributed greatly to communities of poverty, of color, of the magnet programs in the United States, Montessorians who trained in Tarrytown in the early 60s who are still alive, through that split with AMI and AMS, and live to speak today of the coming together in many ways. I'm a former board member of the Montessori Public Policy Initiative, and that was envisioned as a collaboration, an umbrella organization to support Montessori advocates all over the country. We now have many states that have state organizations who are working for the children in their state and working to help decision makers understand what Montessori is, because it's an educational process for adults as well to get.
Yeah.
But recently, I think it was Montessori for Social Justice offered a lovely overview of some of very significant women and men of color who were extraordinarily helpful in their own communities. But the story, it needs to be told in a broader way of so many people who these living legacies aren't going to be alive a lot longer. And to tell the stories of working with Coretta Scott King in Atlanta to start a Montessori school, there are people like Mary Rodanis who did that. And they have stories to tell. And I'm not putting more work on your shoulders because you're doing a tremendous job. But I feel like if those stories, those interviews, those chances to talk to so many of the people could be told, those are the stories that the trainees need to hear also, so we understand what is this movement that we are part of, that we are living now as we teach and we work, or we grow old and die in this movement, this work. Because there are so many anecdotes and so many significant people that have started and done amazing work in our country, not only across the world. I mean, it would be wonderful to, ESF has told some of those stories, that the Educators Without Frontiers, and I'm part of that too, but just in the United States, because we have such a wealth of wisdom, and often it isn't celebrated enough by our national organizations. They try, and they're trying better every year, but in the meantime, these 80 or 70, 80, 90-year-old people are there, and they need to be spoken with so that their words are remembered and heard in this story of our history. But thank you so much for the work that you've done.
That's a great idea. I love that. I'll have to talk to Dr. Lillard about it and see if I can work it in somehow.
I was, as you were thinking, Patrice, I'm also thinking about the rise kind of the public sector. And I know that Mira, Dr. Debs, has done some of that work, has started some of that work, and talking about how Montessori in the public sector really rose. And I think that that's also a place where, as Patrice is saying, there are voices. I know that just last year we lost two folks who could speak to the history in the DC area, right? Which is really hard to lose people who have so much history to share, and we didn't get to them, so it is a real thing that we are losing them quickly.
Sorry, I just wanted to say one more thing too. Yes, thank you, Rachel. In the in the differences that exist or have existed or have purported to exist or have been part of the schism, I guess you would say, between AMI and AMS, that doesn't exist anywhere else in Montessori in the world. This is existing in the United States because of personalities. But that it happened, in the 60s, and certainly there were lots of hard feelings and lots of stuff and, but I do want to say that over time, even with significant differences that are differences in philosophical orientation, which is, perfectly within the right of people to have, there is a great need and respect for both AMI and AMS within the leadership of AMI and AMS. And they try to work closely together to advocate for the child. Yes, the specifics of the training, the length of time teachers are trained, the acceptance of various materials versus not extra materials in the classroom, lots and lots of little points of difference. However, I think the overall goal has moved the needle tremendously toward harmony and unity. And there are speakers from AMI and speakers from AMS have spoken at each other's conferences. We're always we always look at each other, whatever our training is and our background, we always kind of are thinking skeptics, I think Montessorians are. But I'm very encouraged by the fact that we are starting to embrace one another, embrace one another's cultures too, not just AMI and AMS, but and having more of a vision toward a wholeness and harmony in our country. So this is also really important work that you're doing that can help bridge that as well. So thank you.
Yeah. I just wanted to, before we all scatter, I just wanted to thank you all for attending and for hearing my little timeline. I felt like I was in the upper L again, showing a timeline and walking through it with some students. So thank you so very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was really a wonderful presentation. I